Good morning, sunshines. Hope you're doing good. Today, one of the major changes in American theater as opposed to theater before the 21st, 20th century was in America. We had women and playwrights of color who both made their Broadway and made their statements as playwrights and also as director and actors on the stage. So we're going to talk today about some of the better known women and people of color who have made their mark over the past 100 years or so. The first female to have a play written to be performed on Broadway was a woman named Lillian Hellman. She lived from 1905 to 1984. She was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, to a very well-to-do family down there. And her business, when she was young, she would go to her family business and she would spend a lot of time in the factory, hanging around the ladies who were the cooks and the chefs for her parents' business, and got to know them very well. And when the Depression hit in 1929, she was a 24-year-old young lady, and she noticed that the Depression disproportionately hit the workers and the owners. Her family, while they were not as rich as they had been prior to the Depression, still were able to survive. But the factory workers that she had befriended over the years, who were mostly African-American women, had suffered mightily when they lost their jobs. So they had zero income. And so she started questioning the validity of the capitalist system very early on in her life. She joined a couple of socialist movements and she started writing plays. Her first play to actually make it to Broadway was a play called The Children's Hour, which is a play based on an incident that happened in England during the 19th century, where there were some young girls who had claimed that the headmistresses at their school were lesbians, and they didn't have any evidence of it. They were just trying to, just much like the girls in the Crucible or in Salem were trying to get out of trouble. The problem was that it wound up being true, and there was a huge incident. But anyway, that was the basic idea of The Children's Hour. But much like with Arthur Miller, Lillian Hellman is trying to ring the bell that there may be some things wrong with the abuse of power in the system. Her first, most notable play is a play called The Little Foxes. We're going to show you a little video here of a climactic scene in Little Foxes, but let me give you the build-up to it. Little Foxes is about a woman, well, a family, who live in Mississippi, and the father owns a lumber company, and the wife is a very high member of society in the Mississippi town, but she wants to move to Chicago so that she can, get the latest fashion, the latest trends, and all that sort of stuff, as opposed to live in Mississippi. And so she keeps trying to convince her husband to expand the lumber company up to Illinois, to Chicago, and he refuses because he's wealthy enough, he's happy enough in Mississippi, he's always lived there. And at the end of the play, he has a heart condition in which he needs his nitroglycerin pills to remedy. And at the end of the play, because she knows that she will inherit the company if he dies, and be able to move the company wherever she wants to, she allows him to have a heart attack and die at the end of the play. Not to ruin the play for you, but we see a little scene here with Betty Davis in the movie version. But again, the play is showing the way that the capitalist system causes even people who are loving, nurturing partners to turn on each other just the way foxes do. Again, one thing about foxes, you may have heard that foxes are sly. That comes from the fact that a male fox will kill its children, its offspring, no matter how old they are, because the male fox knows that when the foxes grow up to be of legitimate age, it could be in danger. So the female fox spends most of her time hiding her children from the father. But again, it's the idea being that the fox will eat a chunk. So here's a little clip from Little Foxes with Betty Davis to show you how this play ends.
You must hate me very much.
No, I don't hate you. That's because I remember how much I was in love with you.
No, I don't hate you either. I've only contempt for you. I've always had.
Why did you marry me?
Because I was lonely when I was young. Yes, lonely. Not in the way people usually mean. I was lonely for all the things I wasn't going to get. And everybody was so busy at home and So little place for what I wanted. Then Papa died, and left Ben and Oscar all the money.
So you married me?
Yes. I thought you'd get the world for me. You were a small-town clerk then. You haven't changed.
Well, that wasn't what you wanted.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't what I wanted. But it didn't take me long to find out my mistake. And then it was just as if I couldn't stand the sight of you. I couldn't bear to have you touch me. I thought you were such a soft, weak fool. You were so kind and understanding when I didn't want you near me. The lies and excuses I used to make to you, and you believed them. That was when I began to despise you.
Why didn't you leave me?
Where was I to go? What money did I have? Didn't think about it much. If I had, I'd have known you'd die before I did. But I couldn't have guessed you'd get heart trouble so early, so bad. I'm lucky, Horace. I've always been lucky. I'll be lucky again.
The other bottle. Please, upstairs, in my room, in the drawer. Heidi! Upstairs, quick! Heidi! Heidi, quick!
Pretty gruesome, yes. Anyway, in the 1948, Lillian Hellman is one of the first writers to be called before the House on Un-American Activities Committee. We talked about again, and we talked a little about Joseph McCarthy in the last video with when we talked about Arthur Miller. And because she was a woman of means, she was able to stand up. I mean, again, a lot of people live paycheck to paycheck. And if suddenly you're about to be blacklisted, you come forth with information, whatever the information is, so you'll be able to continue to work. But because her family had means, and she was able to fight it, she became a member of what was called the Group of 14, who were the 14 original members called before the HUAC, who refused to answer questions and stood up to the committee. She spent a good part of the next 10 years of her life fighting that committee. So in total, she only, in her career, which again spanned a good number of years. The problem was for the good middle part of 10, 12 years, she didn't write any plays. So totally she only wrote 10 plays, but also helped to write 6 movies. The nice thing about the film, she was able to do things like translate Candide, which is a musical that appeared in the mid-50s. She was able to translate it from French into English, so even though she wasn't the playwright, she was the translator and for that and the movie version. So she was able to get some employment over those years. One of the fun things about her, she was the lover of Dashiell Hammett. You may know Dashiell Hammett. He wrote the Thin Man series. He wrote the Maltese Falcon. So he was a writer in Hollywood during the 40s and 50s, and so they were lovers. She made her comeback to Broadway in '61 with a play called Toys in the Attic. But it just sort of shows how much she could have been had she not had to spend her entire career fighting against the abuse of power by the HUAC committee. The next lady we're going to talk about is probably the best English female playwright. She is still alive. Her name is Carol Churchill. She was born in 1938, so she's getting up there. One of the things about Carol Churchill, when she was young, she had 3 children. And when they were at school, she was a stay-at-home mom. And so she would just write little plot scenarios, that sort of stuff, and take them to her local community theater. And she would have the actors at the theater company in England work themselves out. In other words, she used improvisation to a great extent, and then would edit the improvisations and put the edited versions of these plays on stage. So a lot of her plays were dependent upon the skills of the actors that she initially gave the scenarios to. Again, to date, she's written about 56 plays, which is a good number of plays. Her most successful play, I'm going to say, is a play called Cloud 9. We'll show you a little video sequence of Cloud 9 here. But Cloud 9 takes place in the first act in England, the second act in Africa. You have characters, men playing women, women playing men. And one of the things about it, when you suddenly have a man speaking as a woman, or acting as a woman, and vice versa, it suddenly points out the sexism in the language. If a woman says something the way a woman would say it, it isn't necessarily obvious how sexist it is. But when a man says it, it becomes very blatant how inappropriate the sexual relations and the positions in society were, and how unfair to women particularly. So that's a lot what Cloud 9 is about. Here's a little video of that.
The train from Victoria to Clapham still has those compartments without a corridor. As soon as I got on the platform, I saw who I wanted. Slim hips, tense shoulders, trying not to look at anyone. So I put my hand on my packet, just long enough so he couldn't miss it.
A boy has no business having feelings.
I don't want to be like Papa. I hate Papa.
But I want to be dangerous.
Shall we go in a barn and fuck?
I don't hate you. I love you, Betty.
Oh, Ellen, what will become of me? Ellen, whatever you're doing, it's not a joke.
Let me show you my money.
You can't separate fucking and economics.
Please like me.
I worship you.
Please want me.
I don't want to want you. Of course I want you.
Oh, Harry, what are we going to do?
I should have stayed on the river. The hell with it.
Why?
Don't fuss, Clive. It makes you sweat. I don't like you, Clive. I do like living in your house with plenty of guns, but I don't like you at all. But I do like the sensation. She's mine, and she loves me, and she won't be happy if you take her away. She'll cry, she'll cry, she'll cry.
Inin. Inana.
Nana.
Nut.
Nut.
Anat.
Anat.
Anahita.
Anahita.
Istar.
Istar.
Isis.
Isis.
Hear us calling you back through time. Goddess of cunts.
Goddess of that bella.
Nana. Babies. Nut. Anahita. Istar. Isis. Hear us, lady. Myself.
She has also, she's won more Obie awards than anyone else. She's won 5 Obie awards for Best Playwright. We'll talk about Off-Broadway here in a second. But Off-Broadway is the area in Lower Manhattan, not in Broadway. And the Obie Award is the award given for the best play, best playwright, best musical in the Off-Broadway season that year. So she's had a couple plays that actually moved to Broadway, but she's never actually won a Tony Award. She has, like I said, five Obie Awards. One of her most interesting plays is a play called Top Girls. Top Girls is a dinner party that has about 12 women at it that discusses the role of women in society. You have Joan of Arc at the party. You have there was a pope back in the 9th century who, when they did the autopsy on the pope, they discovered she had been a woman her whole life. It's obviously, and so one of the rules. I don't know if you've ever read the Dan Brown novel Angels and Demons, but one of the things that the crux of the novel is that it is illegal to perform an autopsy on a pope after he dies. Because of this incident, because they discovered that the Pope was a female. Anyway, she's one of the women at the, Amelia Earhart's at the dinner. Anyway, it's all these famous women throughout history having dinner, two modern housewives, discussing the role of women in society, what their responsibility are to their sex, to their time period, to the people around them, all that sort of stuff. So it's a very interesting play along those lines. And you can see how a group of people might be able to come improvise this action. But of course, it was her job as the playwright to edit these things down. She tends to, her plays tend to be very political in nature. They tend to want to discuss females' issues and the woman's right and responsibilities within society during those periods. Cool. One of her later plays is a play written in 2005 called Drunk Enough to Say I Love You, in which it shows how much the British government is submissive to the U.S. government, and it's a very funny play. Probably one of the funniest female playwrights, speaking of funny, Marcia Norman. Well, funny and crazy. She's been through various periods in her life. She was born in 1947, still alive today. She's written 14 plays, 5 musicals. Initially, her first famous play was a play called Getting Out, which is about life in a female prison camp. And then she won her Pulitzer Prize for a play called Night Mother, which is not funny at all. Night Mother is literally the most depressing play I've ever read. It's a 2-woman play. There's a woman in her 40s and her mother who is in her 60s, late 60s, early 70s. And at the beginning of the play, the mother comes in and announces to the daughter that she's going to go into the next room and commit suicide, and is bringing her things, her legal papers and all those things, so she can tie up loose ends after she has died. And the daughter spends the entire 2.5 hour play trying to convince her mother that suicide is not an option. And at the end of the play, she goes upstairs, and the mother goes upstairs and shoots herself. It is not funny. And if you're suicidal, please stay away from this play. But it does show the psychological state of people who are in that kind of situation. But I would not encourage, if you're at least bit suicidal, notice it, keep them far away from that play. Now, having written these very serious dramas, Marcia Norman then went to this period of writing these musicals, which are very light, very colorful. She wrote The Red Shoes, which is about a little girl who wants to dance, and so she puts on these red shoes, and the problem is she can dance like a wind, but of course can't stop dancing. She wrote the musical The Color Purple. She didn't write the music, she just writes the books to these musicals. But then she's also, her most recent musical is a musical called The Bridges of Madison County, which is based on the movie with Clint Eastwood and that sort of thing. So she's sort of schizophrenic. She has her light days, and then she has her very serious days. But she is a very interesting playwright. Her plays are very different. She speaks with a different voice with each of her plays, which is a skill and something as a playwright that shows how powerful you are, because the characters control the action as opposed to the playwright imposing the action, if that makes any sense. Probably the female who's had the biggest impact, although she died at a very young age, is a woman named Wendy Wasserstein. Wendy Wasserstein was born in 1950, died unfortunately in 2005. She was a graduate student at Yale University when she was hired by the Seattle Repertory Theater to become their playwright in residence in 1970. So she was only 20 years old when she was hired to become the first American playwright in residence. And what I mean by that is that they hired her to just do nothing but write plays. Normally the way playwrights work is the playwright writes the play, submits the play to a producer, finds somebody to produce the play, and then once the play has become successful, the playwright starts making money from it. In Wendy Wasserstein's case, Seattle Repertory said, you know what, we want to hire somebody on staff who is here to write plays for us so that we can then take the plays, and then if they become successful, eventually they get to Broadway, which is several of her plays did. She wrote a total of 11 plays. She also wrote 2 movies. Her most successful off-Broadway show was a play called Isn't It Romantic? She also won a Pulitzer Prize for the play called The Heidi Chronicles. The Heidi Chronicles is a play about a group of women in a counseling session. They feed off of each other's idiosyncrasies. We're going to show you a little clip from that so you can get a little sense of the flavor of Heidi Chronicles.
Okay, Fran. I met a guy 3 years ago at a Eugene McCarthy mixer.
Jesus. Neat and clean for Eugene.
Anyway, we've been seeing each other off and on ever since. He dates a lot of other women. And I get to see him maybe once every few weeks. He's a teaching fellow at the law school. Becky, the law school means Yale Law School. I'm an Eastern egalitarian asshole from Chicago.
So, big deal.
Thanks.
The point is that Heidi will drop anything. Work, a date, even a chance to see me. Just to be around this creep.
He is a creep. But he's a charismatic creep.
I fucking hate charisma.
When I need him, he's aloof. But if I try to get better and leave him, he's unbelievably attentive.
Your asshole sounds just like my asshole.
But you see, Becky, the problem isn't really him. The problem is me. I could make a better choice. I have an old friend, Peter, who I know would be a much better choice. But I keep allowing this guy to account for so much of what I think of myself. I allow him to make me feel valuable. And the bottom line is I know that's wrong. I would tell any friend of mine that's wrong. You either shave your legs or you don't.
Again, one of the things about Wendy Wasserstein, it may not be obvious from that clip, but being a Jewish lady, her plays tend to deal with Jewish women's issues, and so her other play of major renown was a play called The Sisters Rosenzweig, which is about three sisters in the 70s and dealing with love and marriage and all that sort of stuff. Unfortunately, she died of lymphoma in 2005, but again, one of the major things about her is that she established the role of the playwright, not just female playwrights, but the playwright in the League of in the resident theater. Now, in a little bit here, we're going to talk about Broadway and off-Broadway, but before we get to there, let's talk about resident theaters. Throughout America, there are these companies like the Alabama Shakespeare Festival, which are professional theater companies that have joined together to create this group called the League of Resident Theaters. In your notes, I've given you a link to the Wikipedia page. I think there are currently 75 members of LORT. Again, that number may increase or decrease, especially with the things going the way they are now. But some companies, Chicago, for instance, has the Steppenwolf Company, but they also have the Goodmans. So some cities have several LORT theaters. Montgomery obviously just has the Alabama Shakespeare Festival. But these are large theaters that have agreed to pay certain scales with equity. Equity is the union of actors in America, and they have contracts with these unions, and they have agreed to terms with these so they negotiate as a whole. They are a group of theaters that have combined over the course in America, and because plays have become so expensive to produce on Broadway, a Broadway play will cost you somewhere between $10 and $15 million to produce. And so producers have found that if you produce a show at the Alabama Shakespeare Festival, for instance, it may cost you $1 million or $2 million, which is still expensive. But it is a lot less expensive than losing $10 or $15 million if the play is not successful on Broadway. And so whereas it used to be in the latter half of the 19th century that plays would be performed on Broadway, and then they would find their way to move across the country into performances after they had closed on Broadway. Now, they still do that after the show is successful on Broadway, but now these regional theaters have become the feeding source for a variety of content into the Broadway theater community. And again, Wendy Wasserstein established the role of the playwright as a resident entity as opposed to just set designers or directors, that sort of thing. You now have playwrights in residence in many, not necessarily all, but in many of these companies you have a playwright in residence, and Wendy Wasserstein was the first to have that position. Now, I want to call this lady the Tennessee Williams of female playwrights. Just like Tennessee Williams was a very Southern playwright, Beth Henley is very much, her plays all happen in the South. She has a very strong Southern connection. She was went to the Southern Methodist University. She was born in 1952, still alive today. Her Pulitzer Prize was for a play called Crimes of the Heart in 1979. There was a movie of it, came out in 1986. Again, just to give you a sense of the type of comedy, it's very lighthearted, very Southern, very genteel, but it's all about picking pawpaws and the relationships between these three sisters and Crimes of the Heart. Anyway, here's a little video of the beginning of the film, just to give you a taste of how the film starts.
Just too awful. How I'm going to continue to hold my head up high in this community, I do not know. Did you get those pantyhose I asked?
They're in the sack.
Now, Daddy has called me twice already. He says we got to get ourselves to town to help out with this thing with Babe before they change their simple minds.
Well, I was sort of hoping that Meg would call.
Meg?
I sent her a telegram about Babe.
Telegram? Couldn't you just phone her up or something?
Well, no, I couldn't because her phone was out of order.
Out of order?
That's right, it was disconnected. I don't know.
Yes, well, now that sounds just like Meg. What all did you say to her in this telegram
Well, I
you
just
sent?
told her to come on home.
To come on home? Lenny, have you lost your only mind or what? Babe is going to be incurring mighty negative publicity in this town, and Meg's appearance isn't going to help things out one bit. These are awful snug. Did you get my right size?
Well, let's see. I think they're size extra petite.
Well, they are scrimping on the nylon material. Anyway, Meg is known all over Copiah County as cheap Christmas trash, while the whole town knows about her sordid dealings with Doc Porter, leaving him a cripple.
A cripple? Well, he's got a limp. He just kind of barely has a limp.
His mother was going to keep me out of the Ladies' Social League because of that.
Oh, Chick, please. I'm sorry, but you're in the Ladies' League now.
That's right, I am. But quite frankly, if Mrs. Porter hadn't developed a tumor on her bladder the way she did, I wouldn't be in the Ladies' Social League, much less a committee chairman.
And during the course of the film, those three sisters, you discover that the youngest sister, Babe, has shot her husband, as you hear at the beginning here. She shot him because she didn't like his looks, excuse me. Meg, the middle sister, has gone off to Los Angeles to try and become a movie star, but now works for a dog food company as a secretary. So she has failed at that, but keeps telling Granddad that she is a success, which really leads to the consternation of the oldest sister. They're loving sisters. They fight like little chickens, but it is truly a love song to the South. She has to date written 16 plays and 7 movies. You may have seen the Miss Firecracker contest with Sissy Speck. Oh, excuse me, not with Sissy Speck. What's Holly Hunter in the role. One of my favorites of her plays is called The Wake of Jamie Foster. And in the play, there's this man, Jamie Foster, who has died and is sitting in a coffin. And as the play begins, people are filtering into this wake, and they're all talking about how wonderful Jamie was, and how giving he was, and how loving he was, and all that sort of stuff. And then as the play progresses and people sort of move out and in and out of the sanctuary, you discover that each person has huge problems with Jamie. They hate him, they had affairs with him. You find out all of this, the backstory that isn't so nice as these characters go along, but of course, bless his heart, he's a wonderful person to begin with. So again, the sort of black humor is what it's called, black comedy, where even though, for instance, shooting your husband is a very serious thing, in the case of Crimes of the Heart, it's taken very lightly and made fun of. But that's the type of play that Beth Henley has. She certainly has a screw loose, I'll say. The first African American to have a play on Broadway was also a female. Her name is Lorraine Hansberry. She lived from 1930 to 1965. She only wrote 3 plays while she was alive, but her first play was Raisin in the Sun. It is an amazing play about racism in the 50s in Chicago. Now, one of the great things about Raisin, and I've included a link in your notes for the whole movie if you'd like to watch the whole thing. Again, the play is about a family, a younger family, and their father has passed away and has left them $10,000 in life insurance money that's about to arrive at some point during the next couple of days. They don't know when, but his son wants to spend the money on a deal he has cooked up with a couple of friends of his to buy a liquor store, and his wife, the mama, wants to spend the money on buying a new home to get them out of this apartment they've had to live in for all these years. And of course, the other ladies, her sister Benita wants to help spend money on her college education, and his wife really just wants everybody to be happy, as it were. But through a series of complications, you find out that Walter Lee, the son's friends, aren't so forthright. They are crooks, and they wind up stealing the money from him. At one point, they're discussing selling their, the mama has put down a down payment on a house in a white neighborhood in Chicago. And so one of the representatives from the neighborhood has come to buy the house back at a profit to them because they don't want the African-American family to move into the white neighborhood. And at the end of the play, Walter Lee stands up and says his father has earned the right for this family to move to this area of the city, and they become, during the course of the action play, one of the first families to move, to immigrate into a white neighborhood in Chicago. Again, it's a fictitious story, but in reality, Lorraine Hansberry's parents actually did this. Her father had moved their family into a white neighborhood, so I would say that she was very, not necessarily the specifics of wanting a liquor store and all that sort of stuff, but the idea of having to deal with the racism that was there. Now, one of the great things about Lorraine Hansberry is she's able to deal with race is a very difficult subject to deal with. People get very defensive very quickly. One of the nice things about her plays is that she's able to discuss the matters without laying blame. It's not like the white neighbors that are coming to buy the house back are addressed as evil Ku Klux Klan members. They have very specific arguments, and the arguments are presented, in a very valid way. It's just that, again, at the end of the play, the right weighs out, and so the family moves in. Her second play, again, not that there's only 3 of them, was a play called The Sign in Sidney Brustein's Window. It is, the sign said no Jews need to apply. And so it is about racism towards the Jewish people. And the African American community was very upset because here's this woman, African American playwright, who's had a play on Broadway. And her second play is dealing with the Jewish community. And her point was that racism is racism, doesn't matter what community it is in. So the fact that she's dealing with Jewish people as opposed to African Americans was just as valid as if they were talking about African Americans. She never really finished her third play. The third play was put together in a compilation called Le Blanc. It is some scenes that she was working on for her new play, but also some scenes from a television series she was working in, as well as some scenes from Raisin in the Sun that her husband put together after her death. You may also see some of her work in a compilation that was written after her death called To Be Young, Gifted, and Black, which exposes it talks about what it's like to be an African-American playwright in the 50s and 60s. Cool. One of my favorite playwrights is a man named Amiri Baraka. He was born Leroy Jones, and in the 60s, he joined the Nation of Islam, which again, I'm not sure what you may know about the Nation of Islam, but in the 60s it was run by a man who was named the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Louis Farrakhan runs the group today. One of the things about the group is that they have very strong feelings about African Americans in modern society, and again, it's difficult to talk about race in these terms, but the Nation of Islam believes that African Americans bear as much responsibility for racism as whites. The term Uncle Tom is something that would be thrown around by this group. Calling somebody an Oreo where they're black on the outside, white on the inside is something that would be thrown around by this group. They believe that your name, Leroy Jones, for instance, in Amiri Baraka's case, was his slave name. And so one of the things that happens when they join the Nation of Islam, they were given their new name, their real name. And so that's where he got, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad gave him the name Amiri Baraka. His nickname is Imam. We may see it also as Imam Baraka. For instance, there was a basketball player in the 60s who became the all-time leading scorer in the NBA history. His name was Lou Alcindor. That was his given name, or his slave name, as the Nation of Islam would say. And he joined this group and changed his name. They changed his name to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. That's probably how you know him. There was also a fighter during this time period who won the championship more than any other fighter. His name was Cassius Clay, but that was his slave name according to this group. And when he joined them, he changed his name to Muhammad Ali. So in the 60s, this was a group that was very politicized, very strong in support. If you've ever heard of Malcolm X is one of the leaders. He isn't the leader. As a matter of fact, I'm going to say one of the things about Malcolm X's assassination, which you're welcome to look up, it's not part of the class, but Malcolm X was assassinated in the late 60s at a Nation of Islam event in which 4 people in the front row who were wearing trench coats stood up and literally point blank shot him, walked out the door, and no one ever saw them or claimed to know who they were. I'm going to say that would not have happened if the Honorable Elijah Muhammad had not okayed it. At least you would have known who they were. It sounds to me like Muhammad was very scared of the publicity and prosperity of Malcolm X, and may have been threatened a little bit by his rise in the Nation of Islam. That's neither here nor there. The thing about Imamu, or Amiri Baraka, is that he went to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and said one of the ways you can spread your message best is by writing plays and opening a theater. And so he opened a theater called the Black Arts Repertory Theater, in New York City. In his life, he was a producer there for 40 years, but he actually wrote 10 plays, I'll get glasses, 11 plays. He also directed 27 films. One of the things about him is he felt like he learned that the problem with theaters, you had to actually produce and spend so much time working on it, whereas film you could do in a weekend, that sort of thing, and have it produced a lot more inexpensively than theater itself. But a couple of his plays have become classics. Probably the best known play he wrote is a play called The Dutchman. Not to ruin it for you, but The Dutchman takes place on some form of public transportation. It doesn't really say. It could be a bus, could be a subway. Anyway, it is crowded, it is rush hour, and there's one seat available when this white woman gets on the bus or train, and instead of sitting in the seat, she stands up and holds onto the rail, and there is a very large black man who is seated next to this empty seat, and he accuses her of not sitting because he's black and calls her a racist. Well, it devolves into, again, this is a very short version of this 2-hour play, but there becomes a fight amongst everyone in the bus, train, whatever it is, about whether it's a racist act or not a racist act, and I'm sorry for chuckling. but at the end of the play, she takes a knife out of her purse and stabs and kills the black man. It is, again, very politically charged. One of my favorite of his plays, Tarzan and Boy in a Clearing. Basically the story is, Tarzan, of course, is the famous white man who grew up in Africa, and he comes along a group of cannibals, and Boy totally turns his back on him, and they wind up eating Tarzan. I don't know, again, why that's necessarily funny, but it certainly is a point of view. One of his most impactful plays is a play called The Slave Ship, in which he describes the passage of slaves in the hull of the ship from Africa to America to be sold as slaves. And it is gruesome, and it is one of the first time I ever went to a play where I was aware of the smell of things. When I saw the production I saw was, first 30 minutes there was not a light on stage. You heard people moaning and groaning, and there was an incredible odor that was not sweet. They came over the crowd, and about halfway, you realize through the course of the play that there's actually a baby being born during this sequence. About 30 minutes into the play, the hull doors are open and slop, food, is thrown down into the slave ship, and you can suddenly see these African Americans that are, Africans, that are tied, chained to the boat, and then having to slosh through whatever grime and grit to get their food for their sustenance. It is gross, but it is certainly impactful, and that's the thing about Mahmoud's plays, or Amiri Baraka's plays. They have a point of view, they are strong, and there's no question that he is trying to cause a political change. Now, the opposite of that is a man named August Wilson. August Wilson is probably the most successful African-American playwright of the 20th century. I would put him in the top 5 of playwrights in America, much less African-American playwrights. He was born in 1945, died in 2005. He wrote a total of 16 plays, and 12 of them were nominated for Tony Awards. He only had 3 actual awards, and he also won an Olivier. Now, just real quick, we'll go back and talk about August Wilson here in a second. But while we're talking about the Oliviers, in London, just like the Tony Award is given annually to the best play that's on Broadway, in London, the street or the section of town in London is called the West End. There are currently 63 theaters in the West End, and those theaters every year compete in a competition just like the Antoinette Perry Awards for this thing called the Olivier Awards. Again, it's less organized than Times Square and the Broadway Theater District, but then London itself is less organized than New York. London was, of course, most of New York was built after the sociologists took control in the mid-19th century. London comes down from time immemorial, from the late 14th, 15th century, some of those streets that go through London. So the theaters are far less congested and far less congenial. But there are, again, every year a group of awards named after Laurence Olivier, the actor. And one of his plays was given the Olivier Award. He also won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, one for a play called Fences, and one for a play called Piano Lesson. Now, just a little bit on Fences. Again, if you're a part of the group that's presenting Fences, feel free again to send me your information. What I'm about to say should not impact what you send me for your research. But Fences is the story of a man, Troy Maxson, who in his early days was among the best baseball players in America. The problem was that African Americans were only allowed to play in the Negro leagues. And so he has this huge chip on his shoulder that because he wasn't able to succeed, he made money, he was a success, according to the legend of the play, he hit more home runs than Babe Ruth. And there's an actual real character, a person who he's sort of based on, but it is a fictitious character. But he is now in his 40s, 50s, and he is a garbage man in Pittsburgh. And he is attempting to become a driver for the garbage truck. He's right now beginning to play. He starts off as just somebody who loads the garbage truck. He is heavily into drink. He has 3 children In the course of the play, he has a son, Lyons, who is a jazz musician from a woman who is not Rose, who is his current wife. Excuse me. He has a 16, again, the play takes place for about 10-year span. But his teenage son is playing football for the high school and wants to pursue that in college. And Troy says, absolutely not. You're not going to waste your time. The white man will not allow you to succeed. One of the lessons of the play is that you can't allow your parents to limit you based on their life. It is nice to have people who have a history and for you to understand that history, but again, your life is not their life. And so Troy Maxson begins to build a fence around, the literal fence around the family backyard, but he also is beginning to fence himself in from the rest of society. And so at the end of the play, he has fathered a young girl with the secretary to the garbage company, and Rose agrees to take the child in because the secretary has died during childbirth. And then, of course, Troy's brother, Gabriel, had a major brain damage during the war and receiving income for that injury from the government. But Troy is taking that money and using it to pay for his house and things like that, which his son is not too happy with. Anyway, those are the basic occurrences in the play Fences. One of the things about August Wilson is that he wrote 10 plays, and each play exposes what the African American experience was in each decade of the 20th century. So for instance, Ma Rainey's Black Bottom was the first of the plays that he wrote in that genre. Ma Rainey was a jazz singer. She actually was born and raised in Columbus, Georgia. And Ma Rainey became there was a woman who invented the hair gel that became the first African-American millionaire, but Ma Rainey was close behind because in the 20s she produced albums, and because her voice sounded white audiences didn't know that she was an African-American. One of the things that happened in the 30s, there were a couple of movies that she appeared in, and suddenly people realized that she was an African-American, and so her record sales plummeted. Unfortunately, she was addicted to cocaine by this time and had all sort of other problems, was into debt and all this sort of stuff, and actually died a pauper. There's a museum to her, though, in Columbus. But it's basically how music got made during the 30s in her life, during the 30s as a jazz musician. One of the plays takes place in 1890 as a play that is about how African-American families attempted to reunite after the Civil War. It's called Joe Turner's Come and Gone. And Joe Turner was a catchphrase for the Klan. What would happen is African-Americans during the 60s, when the 1860s we're talking, would either flee and or when they were freed, ran north. And so by the 1890s, you had a lot of African-American families who were coming back south to reconnect to family, to siblings, to offspring. And so they would go to the local sheriff's office to say, have you seen, do you know, have records of this person? And if the person came back and said, Joe Turner came and got them, that was code for the Klan killed them. So stop trying to look for them. Now the thing about it is usually the person who was telling you this was the sheriff, and in most small towns in the South, the reason they would know was because the sheriff was probably the leader of the Klan during that time in that community anyway. So fortunately, I hope you have never heard of the phrase Joe Turner, but that's the story of Joe Turner. And again, each of his plays at a different level there's one of his latter plays, it's called a play called King Hedley, and it shows how even an African-American who has the best of intentions once money gets involved starts using, he owns a housing project, and instead of putting the money back into the project, really lets it go to waste, and yet just as a white owner would, he charges the black owners until he evicts them and finally and all that sort of stuff. So again, trying to show the ills of the capitalist system. Cool. All right. Two more things before we're out of here today. Let's talk about David Henry Hwang. Probably the best known Asian American playwright is David Henry Hwang, who was born in 1957. He was studied under Sam Shepard, who we haven't talked about yet, but we will next class period. Sam Shepard is one of the great American playwrights. Sam Shepard's motto is the American West. His plays tend to be involved with people who are cowboys and very strong-willed men. Anyway, Henry Wang studied under Sam Shepard. His most successful play, and a play that's in your book that you could do extra credit if you'd like to, is a play called M. Butterfly. Now, I'm going to briefly give you a synopsis of M. Butterfly. We may include a video of a scene. I'm not real sure how much time we have on video left. But M. Butterfly is about this British officer before and after the Second World War in Japan. And he has a lover, a geisha girl who winds up being his lover before the war. And when the war starts, he's sent back to England. And when he gets back after the war, he discovers that his lover, his geisha, has had a son. And it isn't for another 10 years or so that it is discovered that the geisha was not a woman at all, that it was a man this whole time. And what they did during the war was they found another Caucasian Asian child and just gave it to the geisha, who was a spy for the Japanese government. Obviously, there were things that they didn't do, but he claims that he had been a virgin and didn't know the difference between this person and a woman because he'd never been with a woman otherwise. So he didn't know. But that's what M. Butterfly is about. And again, a weird subject matter. We're going to talk a little bit about postmodernism in a couple weeks. He probably had the most successful postmodern play on Broadway called A Thousand Airplanes on the Roof. We'll talk more about postmodernism when we get there in a couple weeks. He's written to date 23 plays. Again, he's still alive and writing. 23 plays, 4 musicals. He's also written 8 operas. So he's very much into music. He's only won 1 Tony Award so far, but he's also won 3 Obies. So he is an up-and-coming Asian American playwright. All right, let's talk about Broadway. In New York City, Manhattan, there are 5 boroughs in Manhattan. The largest are the Bronx and Brooklyn. There's also, first of all, in Manhattan, in New York City, there are 8 million people that live in the city. We have 4 million people that live in the state of Alabama. So the city of New York is twice the size of the state of Alabama. There are 5 boroughs. There's the Bronx and Brooklyn. There's Queens. There's Manhattan Island, and then there's Staten Island. Staten Island is the smallest, only has like 500,000 people in it. But Manhattan is the center of New York. Central Park is in the center of Manhattan Island, and below Central Park there is this, there's a street to the west side of Manhattan that cuts through and comes down to the east side of the lower half tip of Manhattan. It's called Broadway. On the lower half of Manhattan, you have a lot of streets, Wall Street, Church Street, all these streets that were built back in the day. And then they start, in the 1820s, start building streets and avenues. The streets are east-west streets. The avenues are north-south. And then Broadway diagonally cuts through that in the middle of Manhattan. And where 42nd Street crosses Broadway, that is called Times Square. Every year at New Year's, when the ball drops, there's a Times building there, the New York Times used to own that building. And where that ball drops is where 4 million people, allegedly, on any New Year's Eve, gather to watch the ball drop. And of course, it broadcasts throughout the nation on television as well. The Broadway Theater District is, right now it has, I think, 46 theaters, it says so on your notes. No, 43 currently. Again, there are Broadway theaters are closing and opening just like the rest of the theaters around the world. But there are currently 43 Broadway theaters that exist between 42nd Street and 56th Street, east and west, about a block. Yes? So a total of 43 theaters in that district that are considered to be the Broadway Theater District. And every year, any play that opens or runs in any of those 43 theaters is up for the Tony Award that year. Now, one of the things about it, for instance, Wicked opened in 2003 and is still running, and so that would not be up for a new Tony Award unless occasionally there have been performers that have been replaced, and the performer who replaced the original performer has been good enough to be nominated for a role of, best performance in a new role by an actor. But for the most part, if the play was open, Lion King was open in 1998, it's been running ever since then. So the long-running plays are not up every single year, just new plays that have been opened that year are up for a Tony Award that year. And so that's where the Tony Awards are given, and that's what Broadway is. Off-Broadway is any theater in Lower Manhattan, and so you're talking about the south side of Central Park is 71st Street. So anything from 71st below, down to Battery Park, that is not on Broadway is considered off-Broadway. And that's where you can get an Obie Award every year. You have Best New Play, Best Playwright, Best Musical, all those things are on off-Broadway. Again, Hamilton, we'll talk more about Hamilton when we talk about musicals. A lot of plays open off-Broadway because even though a Broadway show will cost you between $10 and $15 million, an off-Broadway show will cost you half of that. And so it's still, just like regional theater is cheaper than that, you want to, if you're not sure about the quality of the show you're doing, you don't want to risk everything. Now there are certainly shows that open and go straight to Broadway. But for the most part nowadays, I would say half of them at least, if not 75%, open in a Lort theater. Another 10, 20% of them open off Broadway and then transfer like Hamilton did. But that gives you time to work on the play and get it up and running before you actually have to take it to the Broadway theater critics and that sort of stuff. Any show that happens in New York City, so the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, any show that's happens in New York City that is not off-Broadway or Broadway is what's called off-Broadway. And again, the tickets to a Broadway show can cost you up to $480, $600 a night, a ticket. Show to an off-Broadway theater will cost you up to $200 a night. A show to an off-Broadway show will cost you $75 to $100 a night. So again, production values are not as high, production costs are not as high, but the pinnacle of American theater is located in New York City. Now, other theaters, other cities, Chicago has a very good theater community, LA has a great theater community. But again, it depends on anything that is ultimately a success in American theater eventually rises to a Broadway production. And so that would be the pinnacle of all those sort of things. And again, we've already talked about the West End being the typical version in London. Cool. I hope you all are doing well at home. Again, if you have any questions or problems about my notes, if there's something else you'd like me to explain, please let me know. I hope the tests went well. I've tried to return those as best I can. If you haven't sent me a test back, please send me a test. It's better to get some grade than no grade, by all means. Thank you all very much, and we'll talk to you next week.